The first time Garrett Pierce saw her, she was curled up in a pile of hay in the corner of Millwood's livery stable, her threadbare dress dusty from the road and her dark hair tangled with straw. It was late October in 1876, and Fort Smith, Arkansas, had seen its share of drifters passing through. But something about the way this young woman had tucked herself into the shadows, trying to disappear completely, made his chest tighten with concern. He had come into town to pick up supplies and trade some of the furs he had trapped in the Boston mountains. Standing at 6'4" with shoulders broad as an ox yoke and arms thick with muscle from years of surviving in the wilderness, Garrett was used to people giving him a wide berth. His sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that fell past his shoulders marked him as someone who spent more time with trees and streams than with civilization. But despite his intimidating appearance, he had never been able to turn away from someone in need. The woman stirred as his shadow fell across her makeshift bed. Her eyes flew open, revealing a striking shade of green that reminded him of new leaves in springtime. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rough wooden wall of the stable. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I will leave. I just needed somewhere warm for the night. I can go." Garrett held up both hands, showing her his palms. "No need for that. Are you hungry?" She stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if he was trustworthy. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones too prominent, and he could see the trembling in her hands that spoke of more than just fear. This woman had not eaten properly in days, maybe weeks. "When did you last have a meal?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle despite its natural roughness. "Yesterday morning. A woman at a farmhouse gave me some bread and cheese." Her eyes darted toward the stable entrance, as if calculating her chances of running past him. "Stay right there," Garrett said. He walked out into the afternoon sunshine and headed toward the general store where he had left his pack. The proprietor, a balding man named Samuel Hutchins, was weighing out flour for another customer. "Sam, you got any of those meat pies your wife makes?" Samuel glanced up. "Sure do." "How many you need, Garrett?" "3. And whatever fruit she has on hand." Within minutes, Garrett had purchased enough food for several meals and was heading back to the livery. The woman was exactly where he had left her, though she looked poised to bolt at any second. He sat down on a nearby barrel, making sure to keep his distance, and unpacked the food. "Here," he said, holding out a steaming meat pie wrapped in cloth. "It is still hot." She reached for it slowly, then pulled back her hand. "I have no money to pay you. Did I ask for payment?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly blinked them away. "No, thank you." She took the pie and bit into it with such desperate hunger that Garrett had to look away. It hurt something inside him to see anyone this hungry, especially a woman who could not have been more than 20 years old. He waited until she had finished the first pie and was halfway through the second before he spoke again. "What is your name?" She hesitated, then said quietly, Josephine Daniels." "Garrett Pierce. What brings you to Fort Smith, Miss Daniels?" "Running," she said simply, then seemed surprised that she had admitted it so plainly. She looked down at the half-eaten pie in her hands. "My stepfather. He wanted me to marry his business partner, a man nearly 60 years old who already buried 2 wives. When I refused, he said he would force me. So I left St. Louis with what little I could carry." Garrett felt anger rise in his chest, hot and fierce. "Where is your mother?" "She passed away 3 years ago. Fever took her in the winter." Josephine's voice was flat, as if she had told this story enough times that the emotion had worn out of it. "My stepfather kept me around to cook and clean, but then his partner offered him a substantial sum of money for my hand. I became valuable property." "You are not property. You are a person." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression softened. "That is kind of you to say, Mr. Pierce. Just Garrett. I do not hold much with formalities." He watched her finish the second pie and handed her an apple. "How long have you been in Fort Smith?" 3 days. I have been sleeping here in the stable. The owner does not seem to notice, or if he does, he has been kind enough not to throw me out." She bit into the apple, chewing more slowly now that the edge had been taken off her hunger. "I have been trying to find work, but no one wants to hire a woman alone with no references and no family." Garrett knew that was true. Fort Smith was a rough town, sitting on the border between Arkansas and Indian Territory. It was full of outlaws, gamblers, and men running from the law. A woman alone here was vulnerable in ways that made his jaw clench. "I have a cabin," he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke, "up in the Boston Mountains, about 15 miles north of here. It is not fancy, but it is warm and dry, and there is plenty of food." "I was planning to head back tomorrow morning." Josephine stared at him. "Why would you offer that to a stranger?" "Because sleeping in a livery stable is no kind of life, and winter is coming. Arkansas winters might not be as harsh as some, but they can still kill you if you are not prepared." He met her eyes steadily. "I am not offering anything improper. The cabin has a bedroom with a door that locks from the inside. You would have your privacy and your safety. What would you want in return? Honest answer, some company. I spend most of my time alone up in those mountains, and it gets lonely. Someone to talk to over supper would be payment enough." He stood up, giving her space to think. "You do not have to decide right now. I will be at the boarding house on 3rd Street tonight, and I leave at dawn. If you want to come with me, meet me at the edge of town where the North Road begins." He tipped his hat to her and walked out of the stable before she could respond. His heart was pounding harder than it should have been, and he was not entirely sure why he had made such an offer. He had lived alone for the better part of 6 years, ever since his parents had died of cholera, and he had decided that the solitary life of a mountain man suited him better than trying to run the family farm by himself. But there was something about Josephine Daniels that called to him. Maybe it was the steel he had seen beneath her fear, or the way she had admitted her circumstances without dissolving into hysterics. She was a survivor, and he respected that. That night, Garrett lay awake in his rented room at the boarding house, wondering if she would show up in the morning. Part of him hoped she would not, because having another person in his life meant complications and responsibilities he had avoided for years. But a larger part of him hoped desperately that she would be standing at the edge of town when the sun rose. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky turning from deep purple to pale gold as Garrett loaded his pack onto his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Tucker. He had already strapped down the supplies he had purchased: flour, salt, sugar, coffee, ammunition, and a few luxuries like dried apples and peppermint sticks. Tucker stamped his feet impatiently, his breath steaming in the chilly air. Garrett rode slowly through the awakening town, past buildings that were just beginning to show lamplight in their windows. A few early risers nodded to him, and he returned the gesture. Fort Smith was not exactly friendly to mountain men, but they tolerated him because he paid his debts and kept to himself. When he reached the North Road, his heart sank. The dirt path stretched empty before him, disappearing into the forest that covered the foothills of the Boston Mountains. She had decided not to come, and he could not blame her. Trusting a strange man was a good way for a woman to end up hurt or worse. He was about to turn Tucker north when he heard a voice call out, "Wait." Josephine emerged from behind a large oak tree, carrying a small canvas bag that looked like it held everything she owned. Her hair was tied back with a piece of string, and she had done her best to brush the hay and dust from her dress, though it was still obviously worn and patched in several places. "I am sorry," she said, slightly breathless. "I wanted to be here earlier, but I had to wait until the stable owner arrived so I could thank him for not turning me out." Relief flooded through Garrett, surprising him with its intensity. "That was thoughtful of you. Are you ready?" She nodded, then looked at Tucker with uncertainty. "I should tell you that I have never ridden a horse before." "That is all right. You can ride with me until you get comfortable. Tucker is strong enough to carry us both." He offered her his hand and pulled her up behind him in one smooth motion. She weighed less than she should, all bones and determination. "Hold on to me," he said over his shoulder. "The road gets rough once we leave town." He felt her arms wrap tentatively around his waist, and then they were moving, leaving Fort Smith behind as they headed into the wilderness. The morning was beautiful, the kind of crisp autumn day that made everything seem possible. The leaves on the trees blazed with color, reds and oranges and golds that seemed to glow in the early light. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Garrett was aware of every place where Josephine's body pressed against his back, every breath she took that he could feel through his thick wool shirt. He tried to focus on the road ahead, on watching for the landmarks that would guide them home. "Tell me about your cabin," Josephine said finally. Her voice was close to his ear, and he felt a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "It is a log cabin, one room with a loft. I built it myself 6 years ago after my parents died. There is a good creek nearby for water, and the hunting is excellent. I trap in the winter, mostly beaver and fox, and trade the pelts in Fort Smith come spring. In the summer, I fish and tend a small garden. It sounds peaceful. It is, sometimes too peaceful." He paused, then added, "I grew up on a farm about 10 miles east of here. My father taught me everything he knew about working the land and living off it. When the cholera came through, it took him and my mother within 3 days of each other. My sister had already married and moved to Little Rock, so I sold the farm and headed into the mountains." "I am sorry about your parents. Thank you. It was a long time ago now." He guided Tucker around a fallen log. "What about you? What did you do in St. Louis?" "Kept house, mostly. My mother taught me to cook and sew and manage a household. She had hoped I would make a good marriage, but after she died, my prospects changed considerably." There was bitterness in her voice. "My stepfather made sure everyone knew I came with no dowry. The only offer I received was from his business partner, and that was more of a purchase than a proposal." "You did the right thing, leaving." "I hope so. Some days I wonder if I should have just accepted my fate. At least I would have had a roof over my head and regular meals." Garrett felt her arms tighten around his waist, and he reached down to pat her hand reassuringly. "A life without freedom is no life at all. You will find your way." They stopped at midday to rest and water Tucker at a small stream. Garrett pulled out some of the dried meat and bread he had packed, and they sat on a fallen log to eat. Josephine looked around at the forest with wonder in her eyes. "It is so beautiful here, so different from the city. You have never been out of St. Louis?" "Not until I ran away. My mother was not strong and my stepfather did not believe in travel." She took a bite of bread, chewing thoughtfully. "I used to read books about the frontier and imagine what it would be like. I never thought I would actually see it." "What kind of books?" "Oh, everything I could get my hands on. Novels mostly, but also travel narratives and natural histories. There was a lending library near our house, and the librarian took pity on me. She would set aside books she thought I might enjoy." Garrett found himself smiling. "I am not much for reading, but my mother loved it. She taught me my letters and made sure I could read the Bible, but I never had the patience for it. I would rather be outside." "I can understand that. Being here is better than any book." She looked at him curiously. "Are you not worried about bringing a stranger to your home?" "I could be a thief or worse. Are you?" "No, but you have only my word for that." He studied her face, taking in the honest eyes and the set of her jaw. "I am a good judge of character. I trust you." Something shifted in her expression, a softening that made her look younger and more vulnerable. "I will do my best to prove worthy of that trust." They reached the cabin in the late afternoon, as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon. The structure sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and oaks. It was exactly as Garrett had described. A single-room log cabin with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. The logs were chinked with mud and moss, and the roof was made of split shingles that he had cut himself. Josephine slid down from Tucker's back and stood looking at the cabin with an unreadable expression. Garrett dismounted and began unloading the supplies, watching her out of the corner of his eye. "It is not much," he said, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his rough home. "It is wonderful," she said softly. "It is honest and real. I love it." He felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "Come on, I will show you inside." The interior was simple but clean. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and several shelves loaded with supplies and tools. A ladder led up to a loft where Garrett kept his sleeping pallet. Everything was neat and organized, the floor swept, the dishes clean. "Where is the bedroom you mentioned?" Josephine asked, looking around. Garrett rubbed the back of his neck. "That is the thing. I do not actually have a separate bedroom, but I meant what I said about you having privacy and safety. You take the loft. I will sleep down here by the fire." She turned to face him. "I cannot take your bed, Mr. Pierce. This is your home." "Garrett," he corrected. "And yes, you can, I insist." "Then where will you sleep?" "The floor is too cold, especially with winter coming." He had actually been thinking about this all day. "I will build another room. A proper bedroom off the main cabin. I have been meaning to expand anyway." "You cannot do that just for me. That would take weeks of work." "More like 2 or 3 weeks if the weather holds." He set down the sack of flour he had been carrying. "Look, Miss Daniels, I know this situation is unusual, but you need a safe place to stay and I have one to offer. Let me do this. It will give me something to do besides pace around waiting for winter." She looked like she wanted to argue but finally nodded. "All right. But only if you let me help. I can cook and clean and do whatever you need around here to earn my keep." "Deal." He held out his hand and she shook it. Her hand was small in his, but her grip was firm. That night, Garrett made a simple supper of fried salt pork, beans, and cornbread. Josephine watched him work with interest, then asked if she could make the cornbread. He stepped aside and let her take over, and when she pulled the golden bread from the Dutch oven, it was the best he had ever tasted, with a perfect crust and a tender crumb. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, savoring another piece. "My mother. She was from Virginia originally, and she learned from her mother. She said that cooking was an art form and that any meal worth eating was worth making properly." Josephine smiled at the memory. "We did not have much money, but we always ate well." After supper, Garrett showed her where everything was stored and explained the routines of the cabin. The water bucket needed to be filled from the creek each morning. The chickens in the small coop behind the cabin needed to be fed and their eggs collected. The garden, now mostly finished for the season, still had some late squash and pumpkins that needed harvesting. "I will start on those tasks tomorrow," Josephine said, "and I will cook all the meals if you will let me." "I would be grateful. My cooking is adequate but nothing special." As darkness fell, they sat by the fire and talked. Garrett found himself telling her stories about his childhood on the farm, about learning to track deer with his father and helping his mother in the garden. Josephine told him about St. Louis, about the grand buildings and the Mississippi River and the constant noise of the city. "I thought I would miss it," she admitted. "But sitting here, listening to the quiet, I realize I never belonged there. This feels more like home than any place I have ever lived." When the fire burned low, Garrett showed her up to the loft and gave her extra blankets from his stores. "If you need anything in the night, just call out. I will hear you." "Thank you, Garrett, for everything." "You are welcome, Josephine." He lay awake by the fire long after he heard her breathing become deep and regular. The cabin felt different with someone else in it, fuller somehow, as if she had brought light and warmth that had been missing. He told himself it was just because he had been alone too long that anyone would have had this effect. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. There was something about Josephine Daniels that had gotten under his skin from the moment he saw her in that livery stable. Something that made him want to protect her and care for her and make sure she never had to sleep in the cold again. The next morning, he woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Josephine was already up, dressed in the same worn dress, her hair braided down her back. She looked up when she heard him stirring and smiled. "Good morning. I hope you do not mind that I started breakfast." "Mind, this is the best wake-up I have had in years." He stood and stretched, working out the kinks from sleeping on the floor. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks. That loft is so warm and comfortable." She flipped the bacon expertly. "I was thinking if you are going to build a new room, you should make it large enough to be practical, maybe big enough for a real bed and a chest for clothes." "That is a good idea. I will need to cut more logs, but there are plenty of suitable trees nearby." He poured himself coffee and sat at the table. "You really do not have to help with the building. That is hard work." "I am stronger than I look, and I want to help." She brought the bacon and a plate of eggs to the table. "Besides, the sooner you have a proper bedroom, the sooner you can stop sleeping on the floor." Over the next days, they fell into a rhythm. Garrett would spend his mornings cutting and hauling logs, working to gather enough timber for the new room. Josephine managed the household, cooking meals that were far better than anything he could make, collecting eggs, and beginning to preserve the last of the garden vegetables for winter. In the afternoons, she would come out to where he was working and help as much as she could, holding boards steady while he notched them or mixing mud for chinking. They talked constantly, sharing stories and opinions and dreams. Garrett learned that Josephine had always wanted to see the ocean, that her favorite color was deep blue, and that she could sing beautifully when she thought no one was listening. She learned that he had once dreamed of being a doctor but could not afford the schooling, that he missed his sister terribly, and that he had a soft spot for stray animals. One afternoon, about a week into the building project, Josephine appeared with sandwiches and cool water from the creek. Garrett was stripped down to just his trousers and boots, his chest and arms slick with sweat from swinging the axe. He saw her eyes widen when she looked at him, taking in the heavy muscles of his chest and shoulders, the way his arms corded with strength as he set down the axe. "You should rest," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "You have been working since dawn." He took the water gratefully and drank deeply. "Thank you. I want to get the walls up before the weather turns." "Garrett, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you really doing this?" "Building me a room, I mean. You could have just let me stay in the loft and slept on the floor all winter. This is so much work." He set down the water jug and looked at her directly. "Because you deserve better than sleeping in a livery stable or even in a loft. You deserve a real home and a place where you feel safe and valued, and because—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Because why?" "Because I want you to stay," he admitted. "Not just through the winter, but longer, as long as you want. And that means making sure you have everything you need to be comfortable." Josephine was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to stay too. When I first came here, I thought it would just be temporary until I could figure out what to do next. But now I cannot imagine leaving." "Is that strange?" "No, it is not strange at all." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering for just a moment against her cheek. "I am glad you want to stay." The air between them felt charged, electric with possibility. Josephine swayed slightly toward him, her green eyes locked on his face. But then she stepped back, breaking the spell. "I should let you get back to work," she said quickly. "Supper will be ready at sundown." She hurried away before he could respond, leaving him standing alone in the clearing with his heart racing and his skin tingling where he had touched her face. That night, they were both unusually quiet over supper. The easy conversation that had characterized their evenings together was replaced with sidelong glances and heavy silences. Finally, as Josephine was washing the dishes, Garrett could not stand it anymore. "Did I make you uncomfortable this afternoon? When I touched your face?" She turned to look at him, her hands still in the dishwater. "No, you did not make me uncomfortable. You made me feel something I have never felt before, and it scared me." "What did you feel?" "Like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Like I had been waiting my whole life for that moment." She dried her hands on a towel, not meeting his eyes. "Garrett, I care about you. More than I should, considering we have only known each other a short time." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her hands in his. "Josephine, look at me." She raised her eyes to his face, and he saw the same longing there that he felt burning in his own chest. "I care about you too. From the moment I saw you in that stable, something in me recognized something in you. I know it sounds foolish, but it is the truth." He squeezed her hands gently. "I do not want to rush you or make you feel obligated to me because I gave you a place to stay, but I want you to know that my feelings are real." "Mine are too," she whispered. "When you are near me, I feel safe for the first time in my life. And when you smile at me, my heart does something strange in my chest." Garrett lifted one of her hands to his lips and kissed it softly. "Then we will take this slowly. No rush, no pressure, just 2 people getting to know each other and seeing where it leads." "I would like that." Over the following weeks, as October turned to November and the air grew colder, the new room began to take shape. Garrett worked tirelessly, and Josephine helped whenever she could. The room was attached to the main cabin, accessed through a new door he had cut in the back wall. It was larger than strictly necessary, with space for a proper bed, a chest of drawers, and even a small window that looked out over the forest. "It is beautiful," Josephine said when the walls were finally up and chinked. "You are so skilled at this." "My father taught me well. He always said a man should be able to build shelter, hunt for food, and protect those he loves." Garrett looked at her seriously. "I have the first 2. I am hoping to work on the 3rd. She blushed and looked away, but she was smiling. The first snow came in mid-November, a light dusting that made the world look magical. Josephine stood on the porch, wrapped in one of Garrett's wool blankets, watching the flakes drift down. "I have never seen snow fall in the mountains before," she said. "In St. Louis, it always seemed dirty and gray within hours, but here it is pristine." Garrett came up behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Wait until we get a real snowfall, then you will see something beautiful." She leaned back against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. They stood like that for a long time, watching the snow and feeling the rightness of being together. That night, Garrett moved into the new room for the first time. He had built a sturdy bed frame and stuffed a mattress with dried grass and pine needles. It was not luxurious, but it was comfortable and clean. As he lay down to sleep, he marveled at how much his life had changed in just a few short weeks. He had gone to Fort Smith alone and self-sufficient, expecting to load up on supplies and return to his solitary existence. Instead, he had found a woman who made him laugh, who challenged him, who filled his home with warmth and light. A woman he was rapidly falling in love with. The winter deepened, and with it, their bond grew stronger. Garrett taught Josephine how to shoot his rifle, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, and how to set snares for rabbits. She taught him how to make proper bread that did not taste like a rock, how to darn socks so the stitches did not rub, and how to appreciate the simple pleasure of a good story read aloud by the fire. They still had not kissed, though there had been many moments when they came close. Garrett was determined to let Josephine set the pace, to make sure she knew she had all the power in their relationship. He would not be like the men who had tried to control her, to own her. He wanted her to choose him freely. One night in early December, a fierce storm blew in from the north. Wind howled around the cabin, and snow fell so heavily that Garrett could not see the tree line from the window. He stoked the fire high and made sure all the shutters were secured while Josephine prepared a hearty stew for supper. "Are we in danger?" she asked, a hint of worry in her voice. "No. The cabin is solid and we have plenty of food and firewood. We just need to stay inside until it blows over." He hung up his coat and stomped snow from his boots. "Could be a day or two. Then we will make the best of it." They ate supper and settled by the fire. Josephine had been reading aloud from a book of poetry she had found among Garrett's mother's belongings, and she continued that tradition now, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the verses. Garrett sat in his chair, ostensibly working on repairing a harness, but mostly just watching her face in the firelight. She was beautiful, though he suspected she did not know it. Her dark hair shone with reddish highlights in the glow of the flames, and her green eyes sparkled with expression as she read. She had gained weight since coming to stay with him, her face filling out to show the pretty features that had been hidden by hunger. She looked healthy and happy, and the sight of her made his heart ache with love. "Garrett," she had stopped reading and was looking at him curiously. "You are staring at me, I know, I cannot help it." She set down the book. "Why?" "Because you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, and because I am a fool in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, more significant because of the wind howling outside, because of the intimate cocoon of the firelit cabin, because of all the weeks of growing closeness that had led to this moment. Josephine stood up slowly and crossed to where he sat. She took the harness from his hands and set it aside, then climbed into his lap, straddling his legs and looking down into his face. "You are not a fool," she said softly, "and I am in love with you too." Then she kissed him, her lips soft and warm against his. Garrett wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and kissed her back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. She tasted like honey and cinnamon from the tea she had been drinking, and her body was warm and soft in his arms. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Josephine rested her forehead against his, her hands cupping his face. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," she confessed. "Why did you not?" "I was afraid. Afraid that if I let myself love you, something would happen to take it away. My mother died. My stepfather betrayed me. Everyone I have ever loved has left me, one way or another." Garrett tightened his arms around her. "I am not going anywhere, and I will fight like hell to make sure nothing takes me away from you." They sat like that for a long time, holding each other while the storm raged outside. Eventually, Josephine fell asleep in his arms, her head tucked under his chin, her breathing deep and peaceful. Garrett carefully carried her up to the loft and tucked her into the bed, then returned to his own room, but he could not sleep. The feel of her in his arms, the taste of her kiss, the weight of her trust, It all filled him with a restless energy. He lay in his bed and thought about the future, about possibilities he had not dared to consider before. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Garrett and Josephine spent the day digging out, clearing paths to the chicken coop and the woodpile. The sun was brilliant on the white landscape, and their breath steamed in the cold air as they worked. "We make a good team," Josephine said, leaning on her shovel and smiling at him. "We do." He paused in his work. "Josephine, last night I told you I love you. I want you to know that I meant it, and I do not expect anything from you in return. You can stay here as long as you want, whether you love me back or not. You are safe here." She walked over to him, her boots crunching in the snow. "I do love you back. I told you that last night." "I know, but I wanted to make sure you knew that there are no conditions. I am not like your stepfather or his business partner. I will never try to own you or control you." "I know that, Garrett. It is one of the reasons I love you." She reached up and brushed snow from his beard, which had grown fuller as winter deepened. "You are the best man I have ever known." Christmas came, and Garrett surprised Josephine by producing gifts he had been working on in secret. He had carved her a beautiful wooden box with an intricate flower pattern on the lid, perfect for storing her few precious belongings. He had also traded for fabric in Fort Smith before she came to stay with him, and he had hidden it away. Now he presented it to her, several yards of deep blue calico. "I thought you could make yourself a new dress," he said, suddenly shy. "I know that one you have been wearing is getting worn." Tears filled Josephine's eyes. "Garrett, this is too much. The box alone would have been wonderful." "Nothing is too much for you." She gave him a scarf she had knitted from yarn she had unraveled from an old sweater of his, reknitting it into a pattern of cables that would keep his neck warm. She had also made him a new shirt from flour sacks she had carefully washed and bleached, sewing it with tiny, perfect stitches. "I wanted to give you something useful," she said. "I know you do not care much for luxuries." He pulled the shirt on over his head, and it fit perfectly, showing how carefully she had observed his body. "It is perfect. Thank you." That night, after a supper of roasted venison and the last of the squash from the garden, they sat by the fire and Garrett gathered his courage. "Josephine, I have been thinking about something." "What is that?" "About us. About the future." He took her hand in his. "I know we have only known each other a few months, but they have been the best months of my life. You make me happier than I ever thought possible. And I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life and find you here." Her eyes widened as she realized what he was saying. "I do not have a fancy ring, and this is not a fancy proposal. But I love you with everything I am, and I would be honored if you would agree to be my wife." Josephine threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." He kissed her deeply, his hands tangling in her hair, and she responded with equal passion. When they broke apart, they were both grinning like fools. "I will build you a proper ring," he promised. "I have some silver I have been saving. I am not the best metalsmith, but I will do my best. I do not need a ring, I just need you. You will have both." They decided to wait until spring to make the trip to Fort Smith and find a preacher to marry them. The winter was too harsh for travel, and besides, they were happy to have this time alone together, to learn each other without the pressure of the outside world. Garrett did craft her a ring, sitting by the fire in the evenings and working the silver with patient skill. It was simple but beautiful, a smooth band with their initials engraved on the inside. When he slipped it onto her finger, Josephine cried with joy. The winter passed in a haze of happiness. They grew closer every day, learning each other's rhythms and habits, their bodies and souls becoming intertwined. Garrett had never been so content, and Josephine bloomed like a flower in the sunshine of his love. One night in late February, as they lay together by the fire, Josephine said quietly, "I want to thank you." "For what?" "For saving me. Not just from the livery stable, but from the life I thought was all I deserved. You showed me that I could be loved and valued for who I am, not for what I could provide to someone else. You gave me freedom and safety and a home. You gave me everything." Garrett pulled her closer, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "You gave me just as much. Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions. You reminded me what it means to truly live." March arrived with the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing muddy earth and the first green shoots of new growth. The creek swelled with runoff, and the birds began to return, filling the forest with song. "Time to head to Fort Smith," Garrett said one morning over breakfast. "The roads should be passable now, and I want to make you my wife proper." They made the journey on horseback, with Josephine riding behind Garrett as she had that first day. But everything was different now. She held him confidently, laughing when Tucker splashed through the ford in the creek, commenting on the beauty of the emerging spring landscape. Fort Smith was busier than it had been in the fall, full of people emerging from winter isolation. Garrett led them straight to the small church at the edge of town, where a kindly minister named Reverend Thomas agreed to marry them that very afternoon. "You have witnesses?" he asked. Garrett thought for a moment, then said, "Give me an hour." He found Samuel Hutchins at the general store and convinced him and his wife Martha to stand up with them. The couple was delighted, especially Martha, who insisted on lending Josephine a lace collar to wear for the ceremony. "Every bride needs something special," she said firmly, pinning the delicate lace to Josephine's dress. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Garrett stood tall and proud in his cleanest clothes, his long hair tied back, his eyes never leaving Josephine's face as she walked toward him. She looked radiant in her patched dress with the lace collar, carrying a bouquet of early wildflowers that Martha had hurriedly gathered. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed his bride with such tenderness that Martha sniffled into her handkerchief. Afterward, Samuel and Martha insisted on treating them to supper at the boarding house, and they spent a pleasant evening eating roasted chicken and apple pie, listening to stories about Fort Smith and its colorful residents. "You two are going to be just fine," Martha said as they prepared to leave. "I can see how much you love each other. That is a rare and precious thing." They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in a clean room with a real bed and cotton sheets. Garrett was gentle and patient, making sure Josephine felt safe and cherished every moment. They came together as husband and wife with tenderness and passion, their bodies learning each other in the most intimate way. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Josephine whispered, "I never knew it could be like this. I never knew I could feel so much." Garrett kissed her forehead. "We have a lifetime to feel it all together." They returned to the cabin as man and wife, ready to face whatever the future held. The spring passed in a blur of activity as they planted the garden, made repairs to the cabin after the harsh winter, and simply enjoyed being together. Josephine proved to be an excellent gardener, coaxing vegetables and herbs from the mountain soil with skill and patience. Summer arrived with its green abundance, and they thrived. Garrett hunted and fished, providing meat for their table, while Josephine preserved and pickled and dried everything they could not eat fresh. The shelves in the cabin filled with jars of beans and corn, dried venison and smoked fish, ensuring they would eat well the following winter. In late July, Josephine began to feel unwell in the mornings. At first, she thought it was something she had eaten, But when the queasiness persisted and she realized she had missed her monthly courses, a different possibility occurred to her. She waited until she was certain before telling Garrett. He had just returned from checking his trap lines, and she was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of stew for supper. "Garrett, I have something to tell you." He heard the nervousness in her voice and immediately came to her side. "What is wrong? Are you ill?" "No, not ill, just different." She set down the spoon and turned to face him. "I am carrying your child, our child." For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it into something radiant with joy. "Truly, we are going to have a baby. Yes, I think around February if my calculations are right." He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. "We are going to be parents." "Josephine, this is wonderful," she laughed with him, relieved by his reaction. "You are happy." "Happy, I am over the moon, a baby, our baby." He set her down gently, suddenly worried. "Should you be standing? Should you be cooking? What do you need? I need you to stop fussing." "I am pregnant, not broken." But she was smiling, warmed by his concern. "I feel fine, just a little sick in the mornings. Martha Hutchins told me that is normal. We should get you to a doctor, make sure everything is all right." "There is no doctor closer than Little Rock, and I am not making that journey. Women have been having babies without doctors for thousands of years. I will be fine." Garrett was not entirely convinced, but he accepted her reassurance. Over the following months, he became even more protective, insisting on doing the heavy work around the cabin and fussing over her constantly. Josephine bore his attentions with good humor, knowing they came from love. As autumn painted the mountains in glorious color once again, her belly began to round with the growing child. Garrett would sit with his hand on her stomach in the evenings, talking to the baby and marveling at every kick and flutter. "I cannot believe there is a whole person growing in there," he said one night. "A person who is half you and half me." "I hope it has your strength and my common sense," Josephine teased. "I hope it has your beauty and kindness." They spent the winter preparing for the baby's arrival. Garrett built a cradle from smooth, sanded wood, and Josephine sewed tiny clothes and blankets. Martha Hutchins had promised to come stay with them when the time came, to help with the birth and the first days. February arrived cold and clear, and with it, the first signs of labor. Garrett rode to Fort Smith through the snow and brought Martha back, then paced the cabin anxiously while the older woman attended to his wife. "First babies take their time," Martha called out to him. "Go chop some wood or something useful. You are making everyone nervous with your pacing." But Garrett could not leave. He sat by the bedroom door, listening to Josephine's labored breathing and occasional cries of pain, feeling helpless and terrified. What if something went wrong? What if he lost her? Hours passed, feeling like years. Then, just as the sun was setting, he heard a new sound. The thin, indignant wail of a newborn baby. "Garrett," Martha called. "Come meet your son." He burst into the room and found Josephine propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "We have a son," she whispered. "A beautiful, perfect son." Garrett knelt beside the bed and looked at the baby for the first time. The infant had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face that was the most beautiful thing Garrett had ever seen, except for his mother's face. "Can I hold him?" "Of course." "He is your son, too." Garrett took the baby carefully, cradling the tiny weight against his chest. The infant opened his eyes, revealing a deep blue gaze that seemed to look right into his father's soul. "Hello, little one," Garrett said softly. "I am your papa. I am going to take such good care of you and your mama. You are loved more than you can possibly imagine." The baby made a small sound and waved one tiny fist. "Have you thought of a name?" Martha asked, efficiently cleaning up the room. Josephine and Garrett looked at each other. They had discussed names endlessly, but had not been able to agree on one. "What about Gabriel?" Josephine suggested. "It means God is my strength." "Gabriel Pierce," Garrett said, testing it out. "I like it. Welcome to the world, Gabriel." Martha stayed for a week, teaching them how to care for the baby and making sure Josephine recovered properly. Then she returned to Fort Smith, leaving the new little family to find their rhythm. Those first months were challenging. Gabriel was a good baby, but he still needed constant care. Josephine was tired from nursing and the broken sleep of new motherhood. Garrett did everything he could to help, changing diapers and walking the floor with a fussy baby while Josephine rested. But despite the exhaustion, they were happier than they had ever been. Gabriel grew rapidly, changing from a tiny, helpless newborn into a chubby, curious baby. He had Josephine's green eyes and Garrett's strong features, and he smiled easily, especially at his father. Spring came again, marking 2 years since Josephine had arrived in Fort Smith sleeping in that livery stable. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching Gabriel play in the grass, she turned to Garrett. "You remember the day you found me? I will never forget it. You looked so small and scared, curled up in that hay. I thought my life was over. I thought I had made a terrible mistake running away, that I would end up dead in a ditch somewhere." She took his hand. "But then you appeared, this huge, intimidating mountain man with the kindest eyes I had ever seen, and you saved me." "We saved each other," Garrett corrected. "I was only half alive before you came. You brought color and joy and meaning to my world. I love you so much. Sometimes it scares me how much. Do not be scared. I am not going anywhere." He pulled her close. "We are going to grow old together in this cabin, watching our children grow up strong and happy. We are going to have a beautiful life, Josephine. We already do." Gabriel toddled over to them, his chubby legs unsteady, and Garrett scooped him up, tossing him gently in the air. The baby's delighted laughter rang out across the clearing, a sound of pure joy. The years passed, each one richer than the last. Gabriel grew into a sturdy boy with his father's love of the outdoors and his mother's quick mind. 2 years after his birth, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, who had her mother's dark hair and sweet nature. 3 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Jacob, a mischievous child who kept them all on their toes. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family. Garrett built on 2 more rooms and eventually a whole second story. What had started as a simple one-room structure became a proper home, filled with laughter and love. Josephine taught the children to read using the books that had belonged to Garrett's mother, supplemented by new volumes they purchased on trips to Fort Smith. Garrett taught them to hunt and fish and survive in the wilderness. Together, they raised their children to be strong, kind, and capable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Josephine back to Fort Smith, leaving the children with Martha Hutchins for a few days. They retraced the path they had taken that first day, riding together on Tucker's back, though the old horse was slower now, graying around the muzzle. "Do you ever regret it?" Garrett asked as they rode. "Leaving St. Louis, ending up here? Not for a single second. This life, this family, it is everything I never knew I wanted." She tightened her arms around his waist. "Do you regret bringing home a stranger from the livery stable?" "Only that I did not find you sooner." They visited the church where they had been married and renewed their vows, standing in the same spot where they had pledged their lives to each other a decade before. Reverend Thomas, older now but still sharp, smiled as he blessed their continued union. That night, lying together in the boarding house, Josephine said, "Thank you for building me that room all those years ago. What made you think of that? I was remembering how you gave me your loft and insisted on sleeping on the floor. How you spent weeks building me a proper bedroom, even though it would have been easier to just share the space. She traced patterns on his chest with her finger. You could have pressured me or taken advantage of the situation, but you did not. You gave me safety and respect and time to fall in love with you on my own terms. I wanted you to choose me freely, not because you felt obligated or had nowhere else to go. I did choose you, and I would choose you again, every single day for the rest of my life. Garrett kissed her softly. And I will keep choosing you. Forever. They returned home to find their children had been perfect angels for Martha, though Garrett suspected that was not entirely true given the guilty looks on Gabriel and Jacob's faces. But he did not care. He gathered his whole family into his arms, hugging them all at once, breathing in the scent of home and happiness. Life continued its steady rhythm. The children grew, and Fort Smith grew with them. The wild frontier town became more civilized, with new buildings and businesses appearing every year. But up in the Boston Mountains, life remained largely unchanged. The Pierce family lived as they always had, close to the land and close to each other. When Gabriel turned 18, he announced his intention to attend college in Little Rock. Garrett was surprised, but Josephine just smiled. "He gets his love of learning from me," she said. "Let him go. He will come back." And Gabriel did come back, 4 years later with a teaching certificate and a pretty young wife named Sarah. They settled in Fort Smith, where Gabriel became the town's schoolmaster, teaching reading and writing and arithmetic to the next generation. Grace married a young farmer and moved just 5 miles down the valley, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to have her own life. Jacob followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a trapper and guide, though he spent more time in town than Garrett ever had. As Garrett and Josephine entered their 50s, they found themselves alone in the cabin once more, their children grown and living their own lives. But it was a different kind of alone than what Garrett had experienced before Josephine. This was a comfortable solitude, filled with companionship and love. They were sitting on the porch one summer evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, when Josephine said, "We did all right, did we not? With the children and the life we built, we did better than all right. We did beautifully." Garrett took her hand, noting how the skin was looser now, marked with age spots and the evidence of years of hard work. But to him, she was still the most beautiful woman in the world. "I love you, Josephine Pierce. I loved you when you were sleeping in that livery stable, and I love you now, and I will love you until my last breath. And I love you, my darling mountain man. You gave me everything. A home, a family, a life I could never have imagined. You gave me yourself, and that has been the greatest gift of all." They sat together as the stars came out, two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something lasting and true. The cabin stood solid behind them, expanded and weathered but still the same home where they had first fallen in love. The mountains rose eternal around them, sheltering them as they always had. And in the morning, they would wake together and begin another day, as they had for nearly 30 years. There would be breakfast to cook and chores to do and perhaps a visit from one of the grandchildren. There would be laughter and work and the simple joy of being together. But for now, in this perfect moment, there was only peace, only love. Only the profound gratitude of two souls who had found their perfect match. Garrett pulled Josephine closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They stayed that way long into the night, watching the stars wheel overhead, two hearts beating as one, a love story that had begun in a livery stable and had grown into something eternal. The years continued to pass gently for Garrett and Josephine. Their cabin in the Boston Mountains became something of a landmark, known throughout the region as the home of the Pierce family. People would sometimes make the journey just to meet the legendary mountain man who had built an empire of love from a single act of kindness. Josephine became known in her own right as a healer and midwife. She had learned herb lore from Martha Hutchins and from experimentation with the plants that grew wild in the mountains. Women from miles around would seek her out when their time came to give birth, trusting her skilled hands and gentle presence. Garrett would watch with pride as she rode off to help someone, her saddlebags filled with herbs and clean linens. One autumn day, nearly 35 years after they had first met, a young woman appeared at their cabin. She was thin and frightened, carrying all her possessions in a worn carpet bag. Garrett was out checking his trap lines, so Josephine answered the door alone. "Please," the girl said, her voice trembling. "I was told that Josephine Pierce lives here, that she helps women who have nowhere else to go." Josephine's heart clenched with recognition. This girl could have been her all those years ago, desperate and alone. "Come in, child, you are safe here." The girl's name was Clara, and her story was painfully familiar. A cruel stepmother, an unwanted marriage arrangement, a desperate flight into the unknown. Josephine fed her and listened and offered comfort. When Garrett returned home, he took one look at the situation and nodded. "She can stay in Gabriel's old room. It is empty now anyway." Over supper, Josephine watched her husband talking gently to Clara, making her laugh with stories about his children's antics when they were small. She saw the same kindness in his eyes that she had seen 35 years ago in that livery stable, and her heart overflowed with love for this man, who had never lost his capacity for compassion. Clara stayed with them for 3 months. Josephine taught her skills that would help her make her own way: cooking, sewing, herb lore, midwifery. Garrett taught her to shoot and to fish, making sure she could feed herself. And when she was ready, they helped her find a position as a teacher's assistant in a town in Missouri, far from the people who had tried to control her. "You saved me," Clara said on the day she left, tears streaming down her face. "Just like you saved Miss Josephine all those years ago." "We did not save anyone," Garrett said firmly. "You saved yourself. We just gave you a safe place to land while you figured things out." After Clara left, Josephine wrapped her arms around Garrett's waist and held him tight. "You are still doing it," she murmured. "Still rescuing damsels in distress." "Only the one that mattered," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "The rest I am just helping along the way." Their 60th birthdays came and went. Both of them had been born in the spring of 1846, Garrett in March and Josephine in April, and they celebrated together as they always had, with a special meal and small gifts and the presence of their ever-growing family. They had 9 grandchildren now, with another on the way. Gabriel and Sarah had 4 children, all bookish and clever. Grace had 3 sturdy farm children who loved the land. Jacob had 2 daughters who were wild and free, taking after their grandmother in spirit. The grandchildren loved visiting the mountain cabin, begging Garrett for stories about the old days and learning cooking from Josephine. The cabin rang with their laughter, and Garrett and Josephine reveled in it. "This is what I built that room for," Garrett said one day, watching Josephine teach her granddaughters how to make bread. "Not just so you would have a place to sleep, but so we could build this family, this love, this life." "You built a kingdom," Josephine replied. "A kingdom of love and safety and home." As they entered their 70s, age began to take its toll. Garrett's joints ached on cold mornings, and his once abundant strength began to fade. Josephine's eyes grew dim, and she could no longer do the fine sewing she had once excelled at. But their love remained as strong as ever. deepened by decades of shared experience. They spent more time sitting on the porch, less time working. Their children worried about them living alone in the mountains, but neither Garrett nor Josephine would consider moving to town. "This is our home," Josephine said firmly when Grace suggested they move closer to her farm. "This is where we fell in love, where we raised you children, where we built our life. We will stay here until the end." On a warm spring day in 1926, 50 years to the day after Garrett had first seen Josephine sleeping in the livery stable, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. All three of their children came home, bringing spouses and children and grandchildren. The clearing around the cabin filled with people and laughter and love. Garrett stood on the porch and looked out at his family, his legacy, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He had started with nothing but a lonely cabin and a good heart. Now he had this. Generations of people who loved each other, who cared for each other, who would carry forward the values he and Josephine had instilled in them. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Garrett and Josephine walked down to the creek hand in hand. The moon was full, turning the water to silver, and the night air was soft and warm. 50 years, Josephine said wonderingly. Has it really been 50 years? It has gone by in a heartbeat, and yet it feels like I have loved you my entire life. I never thanked you properly for building me that room. She smiled up at him, her face lined with age but still beautiful to him. You gave me everything when you did that. Respect and safety and time to heal. You gave me the space to become myself again. And you gave me a reason to build it. A reason to hope and dream and love. He pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. You took a lonely mountain man and turned him into the happiest man alive. They stood by the creek for a long time, holding each other under the stars. Two people who had found their way through darkness to light, from despair to joy, from loneliness to love. Garrett Pierce passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years later at the age of 81. He died as he had lived for the past 53 years, with Josephine beside him, her hand in his. His last words were, "I love you," and his last sight was her face, still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Josephine followed him 6 months later, her heart simply unable to continue without its other half. Their children found her in the rocking chair on the porch, a peaceful smile on her face, looking out over the mountains she had loved. They were buried together on a hillside overlooking the cabin, under the shade of a massive oak tree. Their children placed a single headstone that read, Garrett Pierce, 1845–1926, Josephine Daniels Pierce, 1846–1926, together in life, together in eternity. He gave her shelter. She gave him home. The cabin stood for many more years, maintained by their children and grandchildren. It became a family gathering place, a reminder of where they had all come from. The room Garrett had built for Josephine, the room that had started everything, was preserved exactly as it had been, a testament to love and respect and the beginning of something beautiful. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full, people swore they could see two figures standing on the porch, holding hands and looking out over the mountains, forever together in the place where they had found each other, forever in love in the home they had built with their own hands and hearts. The story of the mountain man who gave a desperate woman his bed and built himself another room became legend in the Boston mountains, passed down through generations, as an example of what true love looked like. It was a story of kindness rewarded, of trust earned, of two damaged souls finding healing in each other. But more than that, it was a story of choice. Josephine had chosen to trust. Garrett had chosen to give without expecting return. And both of them had chosen, day after day for 50 years, to love each other with everything they had. Their great-grandchildren still live in Arkansas, carrying forward the legacy of Garrett and Josephine Pierce. They tell the story to their own children, making sure the tale is never forgotten. The tale of how a mountain man saw a woman sleeping in a livery stable and decided to give her not just shelter but a future. Not just a room but a home. Not just his protection but his heart. And in doing so, he found his own salvation. Because sometimes, the person you rescue ends up rescuing you right back. Sometimes, the room you build becomes the foundation for a palace. And sometimes, a chance encounter in a livery stable in Fort Smith, Arkansas, becomes the beginning of a love story that echoes through the ages, inspiring everyone who hears it to believe in the possibility of redemption, second chances, and love that conquers all. The legacy of their love lived on in every kind act, every moment of compassion, every time someone chose to help a stranger in need. Garrett and Josephine Pierce had shown that one person's kindness could change a life, and that one life changed could ripple outward to touch generations. Their story was complete, their love eternal, their impact immeasurable. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.